Morning, Garrett. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you as well. Welcome to the archive. Um, I am excited that we are having this conversation today in what seemed like the never-ending email and my crash course in linguistics, just when I thought I might have known maybe about a pinch of salt's worth. Um, you took me to school. So let us get started. Today's going to be our first day where we talk in depth and technical about linguistics for the first time on the channel. And let us get started with you and your background in linguistics.
Yeah, my interest in linguistics goes back to when I was 11, and I found a book about the decipherment of Linear B, the syllabic script that was used in ancient Crete. And it was found, large numbers of tablets were found in the 19th century by Arthur Evans, the archaeologist, and his associates, but it couldn't be read. No one knew what on earth it was about, what language it might be in, and it took a long time for it to be deciphered. It was deciphered by Michael Ventus and John Chadwick in the early 1950s. And it's very early Greek, but not written in the Greek alphabet at all, written in this syllabic script. Each symbol represents a syllable. And I was absolutely fascinated by this book. And I started getting and reading more linguistics books. I had done French at primary school. I was now doing Latin as well. I started Greek at 12, and that was all input, grist to the mill of someone who was getting an increasing interest in languages and how they work and how they are related and how they change and vary and so on. In the end, I did a classics degree at Oxford, which had linguistics and philology, the English rather than the continental use of the term philology, historical comparative linguistics, as part of my classics degree. And I was under the great Anna Morpurgo Davis, who was professor of comparative philology, working in what was, I think, her fourth language in English. And her post was previously held by Joseph Wright, who was Tolkien's main tutor. And they feature in the movie about the young Tolkien. And that was an amazing experience. She became like a second mother to me, in fact. And then I moved on then to Reading University, which is 30 miles down the road towards London. Reading then had the best linguistics department in England. Some very big shots were there. And I did a 1-year taught master's degree and then a PhD on a sociolinguistic come dialectological topic about variation in the pronunciation mainly of English in my home area, which was on the fringe of Liverpool. So I was getting an interface between Liverpool urban speech and the rural dialect of the area to the south. And I got my PhD in 1982, and I then could only get one job, which was in Singapore. And so I became a lecturer in linguistics and a researcher in linguistics. And I had no particular interest in a career in the sense of promotion. I just moved from one interesting job to another, two in Hong Kong, one in Western Australia, and then for 13 years in Melbourne, in Victoria, Australia, and managed to retire young and devote myself more to my interests than to what an employer wanted me to be doing. The skeptical stuff, I've been interested in skepticism since my teens, and I gradually realized that there were lots of linguistic claims and ideas which warranted a skeptical approach. But there was no one doing it, or very few were doing it, because the intersect between the sets of professional linguists on the one hand and committed skeptics on the other is very small. And as I speak, there are probably less than 10 of us in the world. I seem to be the only active skeptical linguist in Europe. And one of the main American skeptical linguists has recently retired and isn't doing much of it anymore. So I'm a big fish in a very small pond. And I once walked into an art gallery in London where there was an exhibition involving language, and I spoke 5 words, and the guy there said, "Are you Mark Newbrook then?" So you can see what it's like. I can't do anything naughty. I'll be found out. But There is another use of the term skeptical linguistics, which is to refer to skepticism, well-informed skepticism about mainstream linguistics. And that's in my book on called Strange Linguistics. That's the subject of chapter 12, the last chapter. But Paul Postal, who's a great linguist, used the term skeptical linguistics to refer to that. I've used it to refer mainly to skepticism about non-mainstream theories, or possibly maverick theories of language. So it's still basically the same thing, but applied to different types of linguistics, different status levels of linguistics. So that is me. And what happens with skeptical linguistics? Well, it's part of the world of organized skepticism. So you look at claims which are non-standard, not part of the intellectual mainstream of the discipline. Often the people producing those claims are not schooled in linguistics. Some of them aren't even aware it exists. And they're sometimes reviving pre-linguistic ideas, pre-scientific ideas about language. Some of them pride themselves on being 18th century thinkers. Or else they've got new ideas, novel ideas. Whether or not they're aware that those ideas are different from the intellectual mainstream about linguistics, they may not be aware of that, as I say. And I discovered that there was room for this activity in 1990 when I became involved with the Melbourne skeptics, and they were calling for papers on new topics. So I offered one, gave it, went down well, and it all started from there, and culminating in the book in 2013, and lots of publications since. And it covers a wide range of notions. For example, it covers non-mainstream historical ideas, such as the idea that all languages are descended from Sanskrit, which some people believed in the West, perhaps over 200 years ago now. No linguist ever believed that in that form. Linguists sometimes thought, at one stage, some linguists thought that Sanskrit was very close to the ancestor of all the Indo-European languages. But no linguist ever thought it was the ancestor of all languages. But some people claim that, especially some people in India who have nationalistic and religious motivations for that kind of idea. So that's one set of ideas, non-standard ideas about what relationships there are between languages historically, what comes from what influenced what, and so on. But then there's lots of other non-historical notions about language. For example, there is the idea of reverse speech, which is the idea that when we are speaking, we're also speaking in reverse the whole time. It's a bit like backward masking in rock music lyrics, but it's all the time. And apparently, when you tell a lie speaking forwards, you tell the truth speaking backwards. So if you say, I love you very much, and you really detest the person, it comes out backwards as I detest you. And there are all kinds of nonsense that's developed out of this, including lawsuits, custody battles for children. And some people really believe this and live their lives by it. And unfortunately, I was in Australia, and the person who started it is an Australian, and he exported it to California. So I think he was one of the worst Australian exports to the United States. There's lots of others, a whole range of things. And if you were to look at the contents list of my book, you would see what a wide range it covers. Another section is on extraterrestrial languages, claimed extraterrestrial languages, people who've been abducted into UFOs and have learnt the languages of their abductors, and all kinds of weird little things, like the story of Jeff, the talking mongoose in the Isle of Man, who was in fact already dead. Jeff was a ghost mongoose, and he spoke Manx and English and apparently Spanish and Hindi. And he haunted this family for many years until the farm burnt down. And then he disappeared. But there's a whole book about him. There are a few books about specific skeptical linguistic topics. Another book is by Don Laycock, the Australian linguist who died tragically young, about Enochian, the alleged angelic language that was supposedly channeled to the Elizabethan Magus John Dee and his associate Edward Kelly. And it does seem to be language-like. Laycock was very careful with it. He couldn't explain where it came from. And at intervals, I give a lecture on that language, specifically on that language and the claims surrounding it. So you'll see this is quite a diverse enterprise. And not many are doing it. And as I say, I'm the only one active in Europe as far as I know. There's an article in Dutch telling people, if you're interested in this, write to Mark. No one has written to me, but that's the situation. Now, apparently, it would be of interest to define mainstream versus non-mainstream linguistics.
Yes, it would.
And this is similar to what happens in any other discipline. In any discipline, there's a body of knowledge, a body of belief system theory, which can be called orthodox or it can be called mainstream. That doesn't, of course, mean it's 100% correct. Disciplines change all the time. What is now considered orthodox was considered non-orthodox in the past and will probably be considered non-orthodox again in the future as ideas change, as more knowledge gathers. But there isn't any one time such a body of material. It may be quite varied. There may be differences of opinion within it. So, for example, many linguists who are in the United States will have a very Noam Chomsky type view of linguistic theory. Noam Chomsky, for many years at MIT in Boston, known also for his political ideas. He's an anarcho-syndicalist. During the Vietnam War, he attracted attention by refusing to pay half his taxes in protest against the Vietnam War, and he was protected by gangs of marauding students in taking up that view. But also a very serious linguist. But it's not always realized that there are many different views of linguistics from Chomsky's view. Often better known in Australia and Great Britain than in the United States. At one time, Chomsky's department had one course on non-Chomsky linguistics, and it was known as the bad guys, which indicates the ideas that were had about it. So this linguistic theory is not a monoblock. It's not something where there's total agreement, but the people involved with it are people with training in the discipline, often with publications, with experience as teachers and researchers. They know their stuff to greater or lesser degrees. Whereas the non-mainstream world in linguistics, as in other disciplines, consists mainly of people who don't have serious linguistic training. People who don't, as I said before, may not even realize there is such a thing as academic linguistics, and who develop their own views with different motivations. Often they're very interested in their own language and think it has a special status, or that its ancestor in olden times had a special status, ancestor of all languages, whatever. They have nationalistic motives, they have religious motives, or they simply have come to a different view by whatever means. But typically they struggle to justify those views in face of what we have learned in the 240 years since academic linguistics began in the West, which was when William Jones gave a lecture in Calcutta in 1786, pointing out that Sanskrit was clearly related to Greek and Latin, and that they must form part of a larger language family. And it was from then that people started looking at linguistics in a fairly rigorous empirical way. People would say, what's the evidence for Jones's claim? And in that case, the evidence was pretty obvious when you looked at it. It's amazing it wasn't noticed before, really. But so the intellectual discipline of linguistics, scientific linguistics, as we like to think of it, has developed since then. It focuses on evidence, empirical evidence. It focuses on reasoning, argumentation, and it should be based, if it's going to go very far, on a broad knowledge of languages. Now, there are 6,000 languages, so no one person can know more than a small number personally, but there's a network of scholars. I once had to find someone who knew Seneca, Iroquoian language, because someone was making a claim about Seneca, which turned out to be totally wrong, the claim about Seneca, but I had to find someone to confirm that. So we have a network. If someone mentions a given language, I should be able within half an hour to find somebody online nowadays who knows about that language. We had a visiting scholar in Melbourne who was an expert on Kootenay, a language of Alberta. He knew all there was to be known about Kootenay. He continued to work on it during a year in Australia. So you see how devoted he was. And also, they should have a knowledge, people should have a knowledge in the mainstream of linguistic theory, although, as I've said, there are different opinions about linguistic theory, sometimes with quite dramatic consequences of having different opinions about linguistic theory. You can get a situation where in a language as well known as English, a very basic sentence, there will be disputed interpretations of its grammar and so on. If I say Mark gave a talk, Chomsky and many British linguists don't agree at all about how to analyze the grammar of that sentence. And Chomskyians struggle with languages like Welsh, where the verb comes at the beginning. They get into incredible contortions about that. And some other types of linguistic theory handle it fine. So it isn't uniform, as I said. And that's what happens in mainstream linguistics. It's on the basis of knowledge of languages, of theory, the use of empirical evidence of science and of reasoning. And non-mainstream linguistics is characterized by an absence of most of those, or a partial absence of most of those. Now, non-mainstream linguistic methods are often involved with non-mainstream theories about things other than language. So, for example, the people who claim that Sanskrit was the ancestor of all languages are often people who believe that at one time, Indian thought and culture dominated the world. I've come across people who think that at one stage, everybody was a Hindu throughout the world, and everybody spoke Sanskrit. And this situation can be pieced together now. Of course, some languages are descended from Sanskrit or from similar languages to Sanskrit, but they will push that to an extreme and say every language is descended from Sanskrit. And they also often claim that cultural things throughout the world were originally Indian things. So, for example, one guy claims that the Kaaba in Mecca, the holiest shrine for Muslims, was a Shiva temple, a Hindu temple. And it was corrupted and changed by evil Muslims. Other people think, or the same guy might think, that some other thing was corrupted by evil Christians or evil materialist scientists and that kind of thing. But in origin, everything comes from Sanskrit. And I came across someone who, in Mexico, who claimed this, that not only Sanskrit, it came via Kashmiri, the Indic language of Kashmir, which is sort of descended from Sanskrit. And when I challenged him on this, he said, I can't take you seriously. I had a discussion about this with my friend. He's an expert on missile guidance systems and yucca plants. So he's a big authority, and he says that you're talking nonsense, and I agree. So I'm not talking to you anymore. And I thought, it should be me saying whether I take him seriously, probably, arguably anyway, but that's not how he saw it. You get people who have become big shots in non-mainstream thought. One such is Graham Hancock, who's made a big deal about the idea of a lost civilization, which predated the known civilizations, and little bits of it can still be found, and little bits of its culture and its iconography and so on can still be found. And you can actually show that there was a lost civilization in the dim past before all the civilizations that we know of. And they talk about sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which appears to be a significant early site of settlement as opposed to nomadic and hunter-gatherer style life, and so on. Now, some of these authors don't make much use of language data. One reason for that is that we only have language data in a hard form from the last 5,000 years, because that depends on writing. Until you have writing, language is ephemeral. When we speak, it goes to the winds of heaven, it's gone, until they invented tape recorders and such. But that was very recently. So you depend on writing. But for the first few thousand years, it's only a few languages that are written. And some of them can't be read. Linear B in Crete can now be read. The Indus Valley script in Pakistan can't. I've seen over 100 books claiming I can read the Indus Valley script, but they all disagree. And some people think it isn't even really a language. It's more like a system of traffic signs or the female and male signs on toilets and so forth. It's not in any particular language. It's a big mystery. Some of those tablets are found in Mesopotamia with that script on, but we don't know what it is. So even when we have the writing, we may not be able to read it or make sense of it. It was a big breakthrough when Sumerian in Mesopotamia was deciphered. It's written in a script which is also used for later known languages, and it was eventually possible to decipher it. And that was a big deal. Mayan in Central America was successfully deciphered, but we still have only a few such languages that we can really reliably describe as they were used in very early times. Someone who's done a Graham Hancock, but with more linguistics, is Robert Temple. Now, Robert Temple, who I don't know if he's still there, he was at Colgate University in New York State. And he argued that the Dogon, a tribe in Mali, had contact in ancient times with amphibious spacefaring aliens from the Sirius system. And that these people came to their part of the world or came indirectly to their part of the world. And that's why the Dogon allegedly know about the white dwarf companion of the star Sirius. They know about its orbit time, its high density, and so forth. And he argued that this is how they learned about this from these aliens who'd come from that system. And quite a lot of his evidence was linguistic in character, which involved loan words between Greek and Egyptian and the Dogon language, which was itself unwritten, and so forth. And that he said you could tell that these aliens, these amphibians, had been around and shared their knowledge on the earth. And he was using linguistic evidence. And the linguistic methods he adopted were very amateur. It's very common for people to say, oh, these two words look similar. They're probably the same word in a slightly different form. And it's easy to find examples like that. If you go through dictionaries, there are thousands and thousands of words in every language. And so you can easily find, if you are so motivated, words that look similar and maybe have similar meanings in unrelated languages. And it's possible to show that that can happen by chance to an alarmingly high level, especially when the similarities are unsystematic. There's no system to it. There's no way of saying X in this language corresponds with Y in this language. Temple didn't like this at all. He didn't react well to reviews of his book, which were not only by me, we had an astronomer and an anthropologist as well. But he was using this linguistic data in a very loose way, looking at unsystematic partial similarities and claiming this shows that these cultures had contact. There was a funny story actually about another tribe in that area who an anthropologist interviewed the elder of this tribe, or one of the elders, and after every so often he asked the elder a question which the elder couldn't answer. So the elder would go into a cave and come out again and give the answer. So the anthropologist said in the end, don't wish to give offense, but is there a greater elder in the cave maybe who's answering these very difficult questions? Oh, no, the guy said, come and see. And he took him into the cave, and on a table in the cave was a multi-volume 19th century French encyclopedia. And he had it in the cave to protect it from the weather. And he guarded it because he could read French. So he was responsible for this encyclopedia. And because of that, he was able to answer questions. It was notable. The answers only went up to the time the encyclopedia had been written, as one might imagine. Now, that wasn't the Dogon, but it was a neighboring tribe, and you could see the kind of thing that can happen. So there are lots of people like this who have an axe to grind. They have a novel theory of human history and culture, and they invoke linguistic evidence in support of that, typically not understanding linguistics well enough, or at all in some cases, to do this. And they don't like being criticized about this. I told you about the guy with the yucca plants and the missile guidance systems. 3 people have threatened to sue me over what I've said about their non-mainstream linguistics. And one of them should have known better. He was actually an established scholar, but he didn't sue me because he died first. And I ended up having a marvelous day at Yale University once when a conversation about this developed. And I was taken into a room where they had all kinds of things that the average person doesn't get to see. So I had a very nice day at Yale arising off this. Please stay for dinner. Please stay over. I can't. I've got to get the Greyhound back to New York. Now, of course, some people may have even deliberately forged things like this, pieces of linguistic data, in order to convince people of their case. They're not content with putting forward a theory which probably doesn't hold up. They actually want to invent something. And one way you can invent things is by inventing inscriptions. There are some inscriptions apparently written in Egyptian hieroglyphs on the east coast of Australia. Most people think they've been invented, they've been concocted. Some people say there are undergraduate level errors in these inscriptions, suggesting someone learnt some Egyptian and thought they knew enough to fake an inscription. And these inscriptions are used to suggest that the ancient Egyptians made voyages to Australia. Best known ones often involve evidence of the Vikings in North America. We now know the Vikings got to Newfoundland, at least. There's a site called Lonsdale Meadow at the northern tip of Newfoundland. And during the 1950s, a Norwegian couple, the Ingstats, whose busts are outside the Viking Ship Museum in Oslo in honor of their achievements, dug up and down this coast at different sites each year. And in 1960, they found an obvious Norse settlement. It can't be denied it's a Norse settlement near the northern tip. And then actually, I know a couple of archaeologists who met digging that site as students and got married. And I had dinner with them in Nova Scotia. That site's clear. There's been claims about another site in southwest Newfoundland, but it's been largely not debunked, perhaps. It was overinterpreted. But there are other things. In Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, there is a stone with a runic inscription on it. And I was allowed to be photographed with my hand resting on it. It's got 13 characters. It's in runic script, but it's not Norse. Doesn't make any sense as Norse. One person reads it left to right as Hungarian. Another person reads it right to left as Hungarian. Hungarian was at one time written right to left. These two, of course, read it with completely different meanings. Someone else thinks it's Hindi, and so on. That may well have been faked. It was presented to the museum 200 years ago by a local man with a known history of fakes and stunts. He was then left outside for 100 years and got weathered. The winters are quite severe there. 100 years later, another man thought, this looked as if it's a bit rough now from the weather, and he took a chisel to it to sharpen it up. Well, he may have altered some of the characters. Since then, it's been inside the building, and it takes pride of place in the museum in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia. The best known case, though, is the Kensington runestone from Minnesota, and opinions differ on this. It dates itself 1362. It claims to be left by a Norse expedition going as far west as Minnesota, who were then killed by Native Americans. And before they were all killed, they made this inscription to say, here we are, we've come this far, we're about to be killed, or something along those lines. And there's a dispute about whether the Norse is veridical, whether the Norse makes sense given the date. A majority of people think it's a forgery, a fake. There's a big Scandinavian population in that area, of course, who are proud if they could think they were descended from Vikings, they would like that. And not all of them would be involved in any fake. It might be one person faked this. It was brought to light in 1898 under a tree root in Minnesota. There's a minority of scholars who think it is genuine, and there was a Norse expedition to that area. It's arguments about the dialect of the Norse in the inscription. So there are a few cases which might conceivably be real, but might also be forged. And I think the Kensington stone case is interesting because some scholars do think it's probably genuine. If it's a fake, it's a clever fake by someone who knew what they were doing and may have had motivation for doing that. Another document that may be faked is the Voynich manuscript, which I didn't manage to get to see at Yale. And no one knows really what that is. It may have been forged 200 years ago. It's in an unknown script, it's in an unknown language, and it looks as if it's about plants because there's lots of botanical pictures in it. But we don't really know, and that may have been faked, and so on. So there are cases like this. And the more attention you pay to these things in a critical way and using different linguists with different expertise, the more likely you are to be able to decide whether something is probably genuine or probably a fake. And you also take notice of the old cui bono, for whom is it an advantage if this is real? That must be considered. Now, if you're a non-linguist, and you want to look at this, you're interested in this, you may not have started with the linguistics. You may be interested in Graham Hancock, for example, theories like that. What do you look for? Well, obviously, you look at whether the person writing it appears to be a bona fide linguist. Do they have qualifications? Do they have publication record? Do they have peer approval as manifest in whatever way, as you would in other disciplines? But some of the most interesting cases involve what one might call mavericks, people who are qualified linguists, but have come to be in a minority as far as their opinions are concerned. And you get this again in other disciplines. I had some contact with Halton Arp, who was one of the mainstream astronomers who never accepted the Big Bang. And in the end, he had trouble getting telescope time in the United States, and he moved to Germany where he could get telescope time. And because he had a non-mainstream or minority view, he was often cited by real fringe people. But he wasn't fringe. He simply didn't have the same opinion as most astronomers about how the evidence was with respect to the Big Bang or its likelihood. And there were people like that in linguistics. There were some people, one was Merit Uhlin, who came to believe that the ancestor of all human languages, the Ursprache, as it used to be called, nice German word, or proto-world is the more trendy word for it, that it existed much more recently than most linguists think. Most linguists would say that was at least 75,000 years ago, possibly 150,000 years ago. But these people, such as Rudin, believe it was much more recent than that, and that therefore it can be reconstructed more than you might think on the basis of the known languages, especially their oldest forms that we have. And you can't dismiss Rulin. He was a serious scholar. He was very well informed on language. He came to a minority view. And they're more awkward. People who don't themselves know linguistics would probably be recommended not to make a very sharp decision about whether Rulin was right or wrong. But you can often say, it looks as if so-and-so who doesn't know linguistics is barking up the wrong tree. And you can tell that because if a linguist has commented on them, their comments will be reasonably critical. But even if they haven't commented, and sometimes people have not drawn the attention of mainstream linguists, because mainstream linguists, like all mainstream scholars, are very busy with their normal work, teaching and research, and they don't get encouraged to look at what might be perceived as nonsense. It's only people like me who become card-carrying skeptics, and also retired early, who can do this. But so be careful if you are not a linguist yourself, and someone presents a dramatic, nice-sounding theory which involves language, you should not assume that this is something which you should believe, especially if that belief would then lead you into other things, like an attitude on a political level or something like that. Some of the people who have these motivations of a non-linguistic nature are really extreme. There are quite a lot of people, for example, who claim that Turkish is the ancestor for all languages. But their analysis of how this would work out, it's very self-serving. It gets to the point where you couldn't prove it was false. Because if you say X in Turkish became Y in English, it doesn't look very much like it. Oh, well, they changed the order of letters. They may have deliberately done that in order to conceal the fact it comes from Turkish. And they changed all the words around. So you end up with a situation where you could not possibly disprove it, because the person can always say, yes, but they altered this and they altered that. So you do get quite extreme cases of this. There are also people, of course, who are trying to make money out of things like this. And I mentioned reverse speech. That became a commercial concern. People were selling reverse speech kits, machines for reversing recordings of speech, and so forth. So when the spectre of commercial gain rears its head, it may not be involved. People may not, that may not be their main motive, but it has to be considered as a possible motive. Once you do decipher a language, which hasn't previously been deciphered, and it's agreed that the decipherment is valid, it makes a big difference. So, for example, before Linear B was deciphered, we were guessing a lot about the Cretan civilization, the civilization in Crete, which was obviously pre-Greek or pre-classical Greek, and it may have been involved in the Trojan War, if that really happened. And there are these palaces, one of which at Knossos may be the model of the labyrinth in the story of Theseus, or twisty intertwined cellars, apparently used for storing things, but it looks like a labyrinth. And this civilization was there, mainly on the north coast of Crete, some of it on the south coast. And in about 1450 BCE, it was wrecked by the eruption of Santorini, classical name of which is Thera, which caused a tsunami, which came south. It didn't destroy that civilization. It did make a recovery, but it was on a lower level later. But we didn't know much about this because we couldn't read the documents. It was all pieced together. Once it was deciphered as early Greek, it became much easier to see at least some of the things about that civilization. We understand that civilization much better now because we can read the documentation. And another set of those documents was found in mainland Greece in 1939. And that again cast more light upon that civilization once the script had been deciphered. Mayan, there was a big battle over many years between Coe and Thompson about how to interpret Mayan, how to decipher Mayan. Once it was deciphered, we know a lot more about that civilization. So it's very useful indeed. And although we also can use, of course, DNA and other non-linguistic evidence, one has to remember that language doesn't always go hand in hand with DNA or any other non-linguistic characteristics. If you didn't know about the slave trade and what happened with people moving from the old world to the new, you would be wondering what the hell is going on with all these African American people who clearly have an African origin ultimately, but they're in North America, where the majority of the population is either Native American or European. How would you account for that? And how would you account for the fact that they just about all speak English? Often okay, in some cases, with a distinctive type of English, but not always. Sometimes you can't distinguish people of that type by their language from other North Americans. You would be mystified. How's this come about? Now, we know about the history in this case, but if that had happened in very ancient times, we would not know. And we would be mystified. What happened here? There was some population movement, but we don't know what really happened. The Hungarian people have very similar DNA, etc., to the surrounding Slavic speakers, but the language is unrelated. So something's happened there. And again, we sort of know they came from what's now Mongolia/Siberia. But if we didn't know that, again, it would be a big puzzle. So if we have non-linguistic evidence, it may conflict with the linguistic evidence, setting up a conundrum. Why might a language be resistant to translation? The Festos disc, which was found in Crete, is not in Linear B or in the undeciphered Linear A. It's a syllabic script, apparently, one symbol per syllable, and it's on a disc. It makes a spiral going out inward. We usually think from the outside on the two sides. It's too short a document. It's very difficult to see how we could confidently decipher that, although many think they have. A language that's completely unrelated to known languages is going to resist decipherment more than one which has some connection. Now, it may be of use to explain what is meant by a language family, because we talk in terms of Indo-European as a language family. And Indo-European is a whole set of languages in Europe and Western Asia, which appear to be related through having a common ancestor. The common ancestor was a long time ago, probably at least 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. We don't know where that was spoken. Some think it was in what's now the Ukraine. Some think it was spoken in what's now Asiatic Turkey, Anatolia. But we know sort of what it was like. And it's diversified into the modern Indo-European languages because the people moved to different places and didn't have much contact with each other anymore. So you get the Romance languages, Latin, and the languages descended from Latin. You get Germanic, you get Slavic, Russian, and Polish, and that group. You get Indic, Sanskrit, and the other North Indian languages, the more recent North Indian languages, and Celtic, and so on. And there are other language families. And the way we can say whether it's one language family or two is if you can show that languages come from a common ancestor, they are one language family. And if you can't show that provisionally, you have a second language family, which may turn out in deeper time to be related to the first, but we don't have the evidence. And we may never get the evidence if those languages were never written. So that's what you have. And there are over 100 language families in the world, which we can't prove to be related between the families. Some of them are big, some are small. The smallest is where you have a language isolated from all others with no known relatives. Basque in northern Spain is one. There's one called Burushaski in Pakistan. I met a speaker of Burushaski in Birmingham once in England, but there's not many getting around. It's a completely unrelated language to any other. It's borrowed words from other languages, but basically it's an isolated language. So that's your minimum language family, only one known. Presumably there were others, but they're gone in that family. So that's the nature of language families. And a lot of work is done on seeing what is and is not member of a given language family. But it gets hard where you don't have writing. And in many parts of the world, writing is only very recent. Polynesia, for example. The only old-ish Polynesian writing is the Easter Island tablets, but the other languages were not written until recently. If you want to try to demonstrate whether or not languages are related or have had contact, that you need to have a knowledge of the language families, of what we know at the moment, and of the history of language contact, or the likely history of language contact. So, for example, some people say the Easter Island tablets, it's related to the Indus Valley script, but they're a long way apart in space and time. It's historically not very plausible. And statistical considerations. I mentioned this, you can show sometimes that the chance of forms being shared accidentally is quite great, especially if you have short words where that form could easily keep coming up in different unrelated languages. And even if the languages are related, the forms may not be related. So you get a word like Latin habere, meaning to have, and German haben, meaning to have. And they start with the same four letters, but they're not related. They're only accidentally similar. The Latin word related to German haben is capere, to capture. Habere is an unrelated word, but those languages are related. So you might think, wow, these words must be related. But we know enough to know that in that case, they're not, because we know those languages quite well. But if we had limited knowledge of those languages, they were ancient languages, not written, we would probably assume they were connected. They look so similar. It's often important in doing this to look at the grammar, comparing languages, but grammar can change. English grammar is very different now from what it was 1,000 years ago. Look, if you look at the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, say, or Beowulf, the English is very different, and not only the word forms, grammatically as well. So this involves intensive study if you're trying to work out whether languages really are related and how, or not, the similarities are accidental. I think I've covered most of what I was asked to cover. Garrett, do you have other things you'd like me to talk about?
More out of curiosity, what is your favorite thing you have investigated, your favorite story so far?
That's an interesting one, because I've covered a lot of ground, you know? Well, I do like John Dee's Enochian language that I followed up some of Don Laycock's work, because Don Laycock died very young, and so it left quite a lot to be still done. And I also like the reverse speech, because it was important to do that, because it was being, he was at the basis of a commercial enterprise where it was, things were being sold, courses and so on were being sold. And I will not say it is absolute nonsense, but it looks implausible. And it was important for linguists who had some knowledge of language to comment on that and make those comments available. I've also got an interest in things involving my own strongest languages, which are the classical languages. So claims to do with Latin and so forth, some of which are involved with weird historical claims. So there is someone in Wales, for example, who's concerned particularly with Welsh and who thinks that the stories of the Trojan War and the Prince Aeneas's voyage to Italy after that war, as told in Homer's poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and then in Virgil's Latin Aeneid, he thinks all that happened in the British Isles, not in the Aegean. And he has maps of Britain showing where Troy was and where Mycenae was. He also believes that Aeneas's descendant, Brutus, came to Britain and founded Britain as a country. And this is all recounted in Geoffrey of Monmouth, the medieval, well, historian is probably a bit kind. He presents it as a history and he claims it's translated from Welsh. But the only available Welsh document appears to be a translation of him, not the other way around. And it's got all kinds of chronological things. Geoffrey of Monmouth talks about Old King Cole was a merry old soul. He also seems to have invented King Lear, as in Shakespeare, and so on. And this Welsh writer takes him very seriously. And a lot of it's involved with the structure and the patterning of Latin and Welsh and other relevant languages. So anything to do with the language that I've had some contact with. In the case of Welsh, I am a quarter Welsh. And although I don't speak Welsh fluently, I know quite a lot about Welsh and I can comment on Welsh. But really, anything that pops up. If I had a student who said, hey, this has been claimed about so-and-so language, I would either into it and see what I could find out. It's exciting because there are so many languages.
What has been your favorite or a couple of favorite languages to have studied?
I like language families where you can see several languages in the same group and you can see how things have changed and how they diversified. So, for example, the Slavic languages, which the southern end of that is what used to be Yugoslavia. In fact, Yugoslavia means southern Slav. Yug means south. And then going up to Czech and Polish and Russian and so forth. So you can find, for example, that there's a construction which is the past tense of verbs. And in, say, Serbian, it involves a little auxiliary verb like English be or have, and then a participle like the English words that end in ing, I am going, that kind of construction. And that's the construction you still have in modern Serbian. But in Russian, the little auxiliary verb was dropped. And now you get a strange looking past tense, but it doesn't have the endings you expect of a normal verb. It has participle type endings. So, for example, it varies for female and male. It doesn't vary for first person and second person, I, you, etc. It doesn't look like a verb form at all. And that's because it wasn't. It was a participle, but the auxiliary verb's gone. And in Polish, they've added endings again to that form. So Polish has a form like Russian, but with personal endings added. And you can track this through from the Serbian situation to the Russian and then to the Polish situation. And you begin to think now, why did this language take it that way? And this language then take it further, will go another way. And it's also interesting if you get a language with a very long history, like Greek, where you can look back now at the Linear B Greek from Crete, which was, we can't always be quite sure how it was because the script is not really very suited to Greek. It seems to have been based on an earlier script that was used, and we don't know what language that is in. But then you get Homeric Greek, which was oral. It wasn't written at first. Eventually it came to be written. Then you get Classical Greek. Then you get what's called Koine Greek, which is the shared, mixed, evened up Greek that was the main language of Alexander's army, Alexander the Great, because they came from all different states. They had different dialects. This is a compromised Greek. And then you get a form of that which became the New Testament Greek, which is what the New Testament was originally written in, for the most part. And then from that, you get medieval Greek, Byzantine Greek from Constantinople, and modern Greek. And modern Greek has different forms. There's a very conservative type of modern Greek called katharevousa, purified, and another more everyday form like dimotiki, which means popular. And they're very different. The katharevousa is much more like classical. So when I was in Greece in 1971, I could read the political stuff in the paper much more easily than the football report, because the political stuff was in purified, more conservative Greek, which is more like ancient Greek, which I'd learned. But the football reports were in trendy modern Greek, and it was unfamiliar to a large extent. So Greek is an amazing example of this, where you can go through, and I love that. Chinese is another example, going from archaic Chinese through the long history of Chinese to modern times, and the diversification with the so-called dialects of Chinese, Fangyan, different Cantonese, Mandarin, etc. So languages like that, where there's a family of related languages, where there's a language with a long and varied history, they are what I think are particularly exciting to look at. And you can learn more because there's more information.
So, out of respect of time, I'll ask my last question. Do you have anything you'd wish to say for future generations?
I think one issue with some cultures is that people are not inclined to learn languages much other than their own. We in England are notorious for this. If you can speak even a little of another language, people look at you with amazement as if you were an alien being. They can't believe it. You may not be fluent at all, but anything you know will surprise people. Hong Kong, people there, when I was there, didn't want to learn anything other than Cantonese. And they didn't want English, and they didn't want Mandarin, even though both those languages are going to be very useful for them. And so I think it'd be interesting if we could find a way of enthusing people more with the idea that it's worthwhile to learn and study new languages. And if you get into another language, often you get involved in the linguistics of that language as an adult learner. You can't learn it with natural fluency the way a child does, or very few adults can. So you end up doing, even if you didn't mean to, a bit of the linguistics of that language. And that can draw you into an interest in related languages and contact situations and so forth. So I think in some countries, it's very natural to be multilingual, but not so much in the English-speaking world. And so on, So I think that's something that I would like to work on, the idea of getting people interested in a range of languages and how they're connected, how they're similar, how they're different, and other things connected with human language as a faculty. And indeed, of course, if we meet any extraterrestrials, that will become an issue again. Linguists will be quite useful if we meet extraterrestrials. Some of you may have seen the movie Arrival, where the aliens arrive, the heptapods, and the main human character is a linguist because she's trying to talk to them. And so that's an area where we'd suddenly become quite important. And in fact, the former Soviet Union used to lock linguists up in sheds in Siberia with people who couldn't or wouldn't speak Russian, but spoke the most obscure language they could find. So these linguists would have to work on that language. And the idea would be that if you met extraterrestrials, their languages would be even more strikingly different. But it would be practice for doing that. And I think we learn an awful lot if that happens. I actually met one of the linguists who advised on the movie Arrival. And it had been very exciting for her doing that. It was very revealing for her working on that. So should that happen? Should someone ring up? Should something come on the radio, television tomorrow? There's an alien spaceship coming into the system. As in Arthur Clarke's Rendezvous with Rama. We'd get very excited as linguists if that should happen.
Thank you very much again, Mark. It's been a pleasure having this conversation with you.
It's been a pleasure for me. I appreciate your interest, Garrett, very much. And I'm always happy to share whatever I may know or come to know about this subject and related subjects.